Hello, everyone. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today for our Bussola Institute webinar entitled Iran's Regional Influence and Illicit Arms, which we are delighted to be co-hosting with the Atlantic Council. Welcome also to our viewers on Bussola's YouTube channel and also to the viewers on the Atlantic Council's YouTube channel. At the outset, I would like to warmly thank the Atlantic Council and the Middle East Unit for their support and for the publication of Tim Michetti's excellent report, A Guide to Illicit Iranian Weapon Transfers, the Bahrain File. When most people think about Iran and illicit weapons, they think about the nuclear threat. Indeed, we have seen news this week that the Joint Commission of the JCPA is engaging in further meetings in Vienna, and we hope that all parties will positively address this opportunity in a joint effort. But the reality is that small arms continue to be responsible for extensive violence and death, and the flow of illicit small arms is a global problem. Small arms are weapons of choice for criminal activity, terrorist acts, transnational criminal networks, and armed conflict. International organizations from the UN to the EU recognize that greater cooperation across borders is needed to limit the movement of and accessibility to small arms by armed non-state actors. In the Middle East and the Gulf, the extensive use of small arms by non-state actors continues to present a significant challenge to security in the region. It is generally perceived that Iran is a destabilizing force in the region and more widely through its support for a diverse range of armed non-state actors. Today's webinar takes the Atlantic Council's A Guide to Illicit Iranian Weapon Transfers as a starting point for discussing the wider impact of Iran's policies in the region. We are delighted to have with us Tim Micchetti, who authored this report for the Atlantic Council. Tim is an investigative researcher on illicit weapons transfers and has spent several years documenting the flow of illicit weapons across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East as head of regional operations for conflict armament research. Tim will provide an overview of the report and outline for us some practical measures it recommends for limiting the transfer of illicit weapons. We are also delighted today to be joined by Rasha Al-Joundi from the Dubai Public Policy Research Center, Bahut, and our own Dr. Richard Burchell from the Bussola Institute for the wider discussion on this topic. I will introduce Rasha and Richard separately very shortly. But for now, Tim, I hand over to you. Thank you so much for being here today. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Great. Thank you, John. And thank you to the Bussola Institute and the Atlantic Council for offering their support and the platform to really produce and put out this important information and material. And thank you for my fellow panelists in joining this timely discussion. So in regards to the report on illicit Iranian weapon transfers, I'd first like to give a bit of background on the methodology and how the work's done and how the report came into being before covering some of the key findings and the importance of the work. So the methodology is rooted in something called weapons technical intelligence. And that is where you physically exploit and inspect an item and document it to derive any meaning from the item about its original origin or more recent provenance of the material itself. So the core of this report was really based on a collaboration that I did with the Bahraini Forensic Science Lab and the Bahraini Ministry of Interior to do a complete assessment of all the material that they had recovered domestically from militant groups from 2013 to 2018. And this is a point in time where the amount of seizures of relevant material was most significant, as well as when records started being kept more thoroughly. So during this collaboration, which happened in late 2019, I spent a few months in Manama working daily with the Forensic Science Lab and really getting an understanding of the types of material that they were recovering. We also did advanced testing of C4 explosives that they recovered, other forensic tests to kind of derive additional information, as well as to create information that they didn't already have readily available. So what the report shows broadly is that from 2013 to about late 2016, there was a really concerted and persistent effort from Iran to not only recruit, but then to supply individuals in Bahrain with material that originated in Iran. You saw this originally from, there were large maritime or overland transfers that were interdicted that contained material that was identical to material that was being covered internally within Bahrain. So this indicates to me that that material by nature had to originate outside the country. There's a real differentiation between material that originate outside the countries as well and material that's being domestically manufactured, which typically would reflect components and construction materials that you could see on a construction site walking around Manama, for example. So the result of this, though, is that a large majority of a lot of different types of material recovered in Bahrain actually originated outside the country, specifically from Iran, namely ammunition, radio-controlled IEDs and infrared explosive devices, all of the C4, and many components required to manufacture this stuff. So the why of this is quite important. In taking a WTI approach, it adds another analytical layer to understanding geopolitical developments. So for example, in Bahrain, you saw most transfers happening from 2013 to 2015 with a small one-off skiff happening in late 2016. So one could interpret this as a potential pullback by Iran in regards to the JCPO being signed in late 2015. Or you could also interpret as potentially the deprioritization of the Bahraini space to Iran by shifting resources more to Levant as well as to Yemen, because you saw a real scale up in support to the Houthis at that time as well. I won't get too much into the details about the specific findings because you all have the report and can read it, and there are clearly laid out criteria explaining as to why these items were identified as originating from Iran. But I'd like to discuss more about like what and why is this important. The reason that I developed this public report is because I wanted to develop something that I myself would have loved to have when I originally started out in doing weapons investigation. There's a lot of hyperbole around that's often rooted in people's biases about what Iran may or may not be responsible for or may be attributable to them. So you see a lot of claims about, oh, this weapon system or that weapon system came from Iran without any actually evidence backing it up. So this document actually provides anybody a good starting point and foundation to start to probe those questions and to refine their analysis. You could challenge narratives, you could verify narratives, and with this information. It also gives you a better idea on the spread of material that Iran has proliferated throughout the region. And it's not just directed against other nation states via their proxies or aligned groups in the region, but it's also directed towards domestic local populations as well. For example, in December of 2020, just a few months ago, there was a spate of bombings against liquor stores in Baghdad that were linked to Shia militant groups. And I was looking through some of the images of the RCIDs recovered from these, and they were comprised of components that are consistent and correspond with RCIDs recovered from Hezbollah, recovered from Bahraini militants, recovered from the Houthis in Yemen as well as a few other areas. So it really provides a nice resource to anyone to kind of access this, as well as presenting the evidence for everyone to kind of probe and assess for themselves. I'll leave it at that, and I could answer more questions in the Q&A.
That's great, Tim. Thank you very, very much indeed. And indeed, you've raised some issues, and there are others as well that we'd like to explore with you in a while. So right now, I will introduce Rasha. Rasha is a senior researcher for Gulf Affairs at the Dubai Public Policy Research Centre, Bahrain, as I said. He's an expert in the Gulf region politics, security, and internal affairs, and has been working in the region since 2011. She's a visiting fellow in GCC politics with the European Foundation for Democracy in Brussels. And Rasha will provide us with a GCC perspective on threats to security posed by Iran's activities. You are very, very welcome, Rasha. Over to you now.
Thank you very much for having me. I will try to be as brief as Tim. I will speak about Iran proxies and how we can differentiate between the three types of them, and how Iran look at these non-state actors working for it based on their role, their experience, their location, their agility, their importance. First of all, we can see a proxy that is a strategic asset for Iran by itself. This we can call this the Iraqi militias. This is because Iraqi militias are residing in a border state for Iran. They are Shia community that can be linked to Iran Shia community. They can be used in its expansionist agenda, and most importantly, they are very important. They are actually essential not to allow another Iraq enemy to rise close to Iran and threat its national security, like what Saddam did back in the 80s. I believe that the Iraqi militias, to be functioning for Iran in this state, need to be Iraq need to be weak, fragile. Its community should be shattered into sects and different kinds of disagreements. Because Iraq is very big, it's almost 37 million people. It's a very big country. It's hard to maneuver in Iraq without Iraq being weak. And second of all, there is the proxy that it's regarded as a strategic tool like Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the cornerstone of Iraq expansionist agenda in the region, and it's because it has the agility, because it has the political cover. It resides in a small state in Lebanon. This way, it's easier to control the political and military scene. It was the first successful case study for Iran to create a militia or a proxy working in the region, and I think for Iran it's better to have some kind of stability in Lebanon to maintain the political cover that Hezbollah have in the state, and because the Hezbollah count on the military on its military its military manpower on its Shia community. So Hezbollah need their approval, and to do that, the economic situation shouldn't be looking like this. This is why there is a paradoxical dilemma for Iran right now in Lebanon, because of the because Iran can't allow Hezbollah to show weakness. Otherwise, its whole Hezbollah whole image will be affected, and the whole idea of its invincibility would be affected in the region. And this is the problem. This is why the stability in Lebanon and the threat of a collapsed state in Lebanon is being jeopardized, and this is why the GCC region is very concerning, because this will affect the whole security architecture that is already fragile in the region, to just maintain Hezbollah power and ability to move between these states in the region and jeopardize and threaten their security capabilities. Also, there's the third and last one is a proxy that is a tactical tool. This is can be called the Houthis, because the Houthis are used for projecting power in the Arabian Peninsula, and they are used to threaten the state of Saudi Arabia. They are used to question the relationship between the US and the other GCC states, and also question the arm capability of the US arm capability in the region, and inform the Iranian people that the American arms are not that strong. All these arm deals are for nothing, just to pay for the US. In the end, it's Iran live on the failure of politics, and this serve the narrative of what Iran wants to perceive in the region. In Yemen, I think Iran needs the conflict to pursue, because to invest and to use the Houthis as a tactical tool. It needs a war in Yemen. It needs the instability. This is why I think Yemen will continue to be a very important threat for the Gulf countries, even if we reach a political deal in Yemen. Because in the future, if the Houthis maintain their relationship with Iran, and if Iran doesn't change its role in the region, I think the conflict will re-emerge. No matter what political deal we will see happening in Yemen sooner, hopefully better than later, and this is why we see that why Iran is complicating the situation, and why Houthis are saying, like, we need to have the Hormuz initiative on the table in any international negotiation. All these elements, all these types of proxies in the region is very threatening for the Gulf countries, and it's watched closely, and there is a sense that Iran needs to be dealt in maybe out of the box way, because they're not the economic sanction. No economic sanction projected any change in Iranian behavior until now, and no political maneuver with Iran or carrot also projected any result in altering Iran behavior in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasha. And now we have Richard Burchell, Dr. Richard Burchell. Richard is a senior research fellow here with us in Bussola Institute. And Richard is a very key member of our team. He has advised, researched, and taught on a wide range of issues in global governments and human security pertaining to extremism and terrorism. Richard is the author of over 60 contributions to a wide range of academic journals, book chapters, think tank publications, and so on around the world. He has also been visiting professor at universities in Canada, Germany, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And today, Richard will outline the institutional and legal measures applicable to Iran's behavior and how Europe can contribute to practical measures to limit illicit arms trafficking. Richard, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, John. I mean, already both Tim and Rasha have covered a lot of the most important points. I mean, I just want to go back to and reinforce Tim's point on the importance of this report in the evidence and the information it provides us. Too often, as Rasha was talking about, there's a tendency to overlook Iran's activities in the region, primarily looking at the larger scale nuclear issue, as we're seeing in the current discussions about the JCPOA. And activities like this fall off the radar, and yet Iran uses them as a key dimension of their foreign policy. So reports like this are absolutely essential because they give us the empirical information, they give us the evidence upon which policies and further actions can take place. Now, sort of coming out a little bit to look at the wider context of this, clearly the illicit trafficking of small arms, the activities of armed non-state actors are morally abhorrent. However, problematically, politically, states like to engage in such activities. They like to support such groups. A lot of the discussion in this current space on illicit arms right now points at the outset to the Sustainable Development Goals, as Sustainable Development Goal 16 calls for more peaceful and inclusive societies. And one of the indicators is reducing violence, armed conflict, and illicit arms. So in 2030, the whole world is going to have to take an assessment on how much progress has been made on this area. Looking at the Gulf region, looking at reports like Tim's, we have a long way to go. Much more work needs to be done. The whole issue of illicit arms, small arms, and light weapons didn't really get going on the global scene in the 1990s. We saw a protocol on the illicit manufacture and trafficking of firearms in 2001 to the Organized Crime Convention. Then we started to see the UN General Assembly become seized of the matter, discuss it further, leading to some conferences in the early 2000s, a program of action on improving systems and cooperation to address illicit arms. Now, as with all international institutions and international documents, there's tons of flaws in them, weaknesses, but it's important it's out there on the table for the discussion. It allows us to look at the text as what was written and say the intention is to achieve this outcome. Why are states not acting? Why is our behavior or behavior of particular parties running contrary to it? So the program of action in early 2004, when it was finally agreed upon, showed there's a bit of political will out there. It did lead to an arms trade treaty in 2013-14, which deals with the full gamut of arms transfers and treaties. It does also deal with illicit weapons. But what's most important from my view on this one is that in these UN events, there was very little discussion about supplying non-state actors. Many states, Western states in particular, were very reluctant to even have the issue discussed because they want to be able to ensure they can supply their armed non-state actors and not have others doing it. So this has allowed Iran to take full advantage of the overall situation. As we know and as we've seen, I mean, since 1979, the Constitution of the Islamic Revolutionary Republic of Iran calls for, as part of its foreign policy, sending their version of governance and government out to the wider world. It's part of the agenda. It's written in the Constitution. They don't hide it. And throughout the region, we've seen Iran's activities causing instability, continuing conflict, and being very destabilizing. Now, we're talking about a region with, unfortunately, a lot of conflicts in different places, a lot of destabilizing activities going on, but this continued sustaining, of these armed non-state actors is one of the key things that needs to be addressed going forward. We have seen a proliferation of fragmented groups, literally a bunch of guys in some cases standing over a larger pile of rocks or a small bit of territory that they consider to be theirs, and they will work with whoever, and small arms will be a big part of this. It allows these groups to threaten populations, engage in criminal activity, extort for funding, money, etc. So it's a big problem. Now, briefly on the EU side of it, the EU has been a big mover in the global regime on trying to deal with the illicit trafficking and production of small arms. They came up with a strategy in 2005. In 2015, their overall agenda on security addressed the issue. And in 2018, we saw a new strategy come out on combating and addressing the illicit production and trafficking of small arms. What these initiatives attempt to do is monitor ensuring compliance with standards and regulations to bring the illicit traffic of small arms under some form of control. Try to ensure that these things do not end up in the wrong hands. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of demand for small arms and illicit weapons, light weapons, and so the demand continues. Going forward, what the EU seems to be focusing on is, again, promoting this normative agenda in addressing both the illicit weapons and their use by armed non-state actors, and supporting others around the world to help restrict access and minimize the demand. The EU does work extensively around the world and is trying to promote greater accountability and responsibility, and we can explore further on how these could actually be applied in light of Tim's report to the Gulf Middle East region.
Thank you very much, Richard. And maybe, Tim, I will start with you. We've had three very interesting presentations now that have raised many questions. And just to go back for a minute to you, Tim, based on your very wide experience, what kind of action do you think the international community can take as a matter of priority to address the threat to security in the Gulf region that is posed by illicit weapons transfer?
Well, that's a good question. And my fellow panelists kind of raised a lot of points that I think intersect with that. First and foremost, I think we really need to understand the problem. And, this might be a bit of self-promotion or maybe just the kind of angle I'm coming at it from. But, one of the benefits of this report is that it quantified the problem specifically. And it wasn't just from Iran, which is undoubtedly one of the larger proliferators of material in the region, but it also identified other sources of diversion of material that is proliferating in the region, particularly from Iraq and Syria and the Levant, material from Yemen, as well as material circulating domestically within Saudi Arabia. There were very distinct ecosystems. So once you kind of map all this out and understand and measure the problem, then you can start addressing it. Whether this is couched within the SDGs, indicator 16.4 is actually about specifically the documentation and tracing of illicit weapons. The EU Commission has recently provided funding, I think a couple of years ago, to support the Arab League in developing national focal points that can to do tracing of weapons themselves in support of 16.4. And there are also these international arms control mechanisms, the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, the Global Firearms Protocol. There's a lot of different ones. However, I think while the international community can provide support, such as doing secondments of technical experts, much as like they did in the UAE, they seconded as CBRN experts to support the development of the nuclear program, civilian nuclear program in the UAE. I think they could do similar efforts throughout the Gulf region, specifically throughout the Arabian Peninsula, by providing technical expertise to support the development of weapons and ammunition management programming, but ultimately the solutions I think need to be developed regionally themselves that are adapted and tailored specifically to the circumstances, capabilities, and needs of the regional governments. And just real quick to loop back on the other source of diversion, there are very cheap, effective measures that governments can do to address this. It is not as sexy as like nuclear arms control, which is a very serious issue, particularly if there's a cascade of proliferation in the region. But in terms of day-to-day damage, small arms and light weapons are really the most impactful. And I think it's within everyone's interest, particularly within the region, to start to get a control on this. You saw a lot of blowback happening in the early 2000s with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, sourcing a lot of their material from Yemen that were then using for attacks throughout the kingdom. So I think it would be a win-win-win across the board if, with international support and guidance, using the templates of international arms control agreements and being applied regionally to start to understand the problem, identify points of diversion, and then to develop standards and protocols that can start to mitigate and limit those. Because ultimately, the region is acting as a giant sink of illicit weapons that will proliferate and are proliferating outside of the region into other very geopolitically strategic regions, such as the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia, for example. A lot of weapons that Iran has sent into Yemen have subsequently been smuggled out and are finding their way into the conflict in Ethiopia, further destabilizing the region. So I think it's very important to look at this more holistically, deeply, and with a very technical eye to first understand the problem before you could address it.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I'll come back to you again because you've raised a couple of issues there that I'd like to pursue. Particularly, you mentioned JCPOA and so on. I'll come back and we'll chat about that in a few minutes. Maybe, Rasha, Tim was emphasizing the region, what needs to happen, how things should pan out within the region. In your view, in your opinion, and you know the region very well, how could better regional cooperation help to influence Iran's involvement with armed non-state actors? And if you like, you can bring in the international dimension as well, but certainly regional cooperation.
In fact, I think there's a point missing with facing Iran backing non-state actors in the region. And Tim's report, I think, is very essential on this regard. I think there should be a cooperation between the international and regional community in monitoring, sanctioning, and exposing Iran and its proxies breaching the international law in the region. The monitoring could be in the region with the help of international communities and experts to validate the conclusions and maintain authenticity. And then I'm not talking about economic sanction. I'm talking about a political or maybe diplomatic sanctions to put pressure on Iran and its behavior in the region with the help of its proxies. This exposure of the information and breaches internationally, because it's becoming sidelines in the media outlets and in any look or reading of Iran activities in the region. This will help, first of all, in informing the Iranian people themselves and increasing the accountability inside Iran. And we saw that in 2019. The Iranian people are not approving their government behavior and the economic backing of the of other non-state actors in the region. Second of all, it will be very important on the psychological level for the local communities not to sympathize with Iran axis and agenda, to expose this agenda and why this has happened, what Iran is doing, what the breaches of its non-state actors is doing inside the Gulf states and inside also the Levant, and what is the map of their movements. And it will also be beneficial on the intelligence level, in the security level, because it will help in the cooperation from the communities and from the communities in particular, to expose the dormant cells and the active cells in the societies in the region, and this is becoming very important if we are looking to Tim's report and the movement of the small arms. It needs society help, it needs people, and Iran is creating this mentality psychologically and affect and control on the people in the local communities.
Thank you very much, Rasha. And I'll move over to Richard. In your introductory piece, you mentioned, or you broadened the discussion to the wider international community rather than just to the region. So we'd say in relation to small arms and control measures, can you describe what is the kind of general position in the wider international community at the moment?
Well, I mean, the general position is, there's both positives and negatives. We have the various frameworks that I mentioned in place. States are participating in them. The information is being provided. The EU, as we both mentioned and Tim mentioned as well, is trying to reinforce support in other areas and practices. But in the Gulf region specifically, we do not see a lot of formal participation, which is highly problematic. Bahrain and the UAE have signed but not ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. We have not seen a lot of participation by these states in a lot of these measures. They are submitting some reports under other various small arms and light weapons monitoring systems, but nothing of substance. Certainly within the GCC framework itself, we have very little. We have a broad agreement on security and movement across borders, but that is about it. I mean, I think one of the things that Tim's report really brings out is the importance of having a regional system for monitoring and regulating transfer of weapons across borders. This would include both the internal borders of the Gulf, but also the wider borders, which are highly problematic in the region due to the large sea borders, but also within the Arabian Gulf, there are a lot of small ships running about. There is a lot of spaces to come to shore fairly easily, and it makes it relatively simple to get arms into another sort of territory. So looking at activities such as regional border controls, spending a bit more effort looking at these more localized trafficking routes would be a big step forward. But at the current time, I would say in relation to arms generally, the states in the region are large purchasers of arms of all levels and types. And what this has happened, what this has already been said, shows the small arms and light weapons sort of get forgotten about. The focus is on the bigger stuff. So the biggest thing, and this is something the EU's been trying to do, and Rasha touched on it quite directly, is raising awareness of the problem within the region. And I think that would need to be done both with governments to demonstrate how the continued proliferation of small arms feeds demand of armed non-state actors, whether or not they're being sponsored by another state or not. That keeps conflict going. The continuation of conflict destabilizes societies, does not bring peace and security to anybody. So it's showing the governments you need to take the wider approach, which governments are trying to do, but perhaps the greater global support there is necessary. but also getting specific agreements within the region to put a lot more attention on this issue would be very important.
Great, Richard. And while you're on that, just maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how the European experience on controlling small arms could benefit the Gulf in the near future and in the longer term.
Well, I mean, clearly the sort of technical expertise, the experience in monitoring, both through the EU and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, have been active in these areas. I mean, the OSCE provides another good example because this is an organization dedicated not to necessarily compliance, but confidence building measures and confidence building measures between conflicting parties. So the technical elements are there, the knowledge and the expertise is there as well. So as Tim said, combining that with the local, regional technical knowledge and expertise would be very important. But also going back to the 2018 strategy from the EU and trying to mainstream this issue, like Rasha said, let's get the awareness and the knowledge out there. Let's just keep pushing the normative framework and the problems that arise when small arms meet armed non-state actors. That's an important part where the EU can be more vocal in the region and finding governments that are willing to sort of join on to the messaging. The messaging would be very important. And so I think in that respect, that would help. I mean, and the funding is not necessarily a big issue for the region. It can be funded internally, but getting this sort of seeing a global actor as good practices and trying to get the wider region to sort of follow along would be a big first step.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. And Richard, you mentioned confidence building, and that was a requirement. Then, based on your research, what kind of confidence building measures do you feel are required that will lead to more effective control over small arms in the region?
Yeah, great question. And I kind of do want to link it back to some of the things that Richard was just talking about. And in terms of confidence building, I think it does need to start regionally. In my experience, around weapons, there's this inherent kind of instinctive reticence to sharing information because it's perceived as there's a security risk associated with it. However, once you start to kind of break down that understanding, seeing a factory marking or serial number is not going to be, lead to the end of society, and it's not an existential crisis, but it could actually support one's narrative and understanding of a situation. One of the challenges previously, particularly within the Gulf region, is that the messaging of the realities of what's happening around arms proliferation was always couched within a very political messaging. And so therefore is discounted. And so I think in separating those things would be a very important first step by letting the evidence speak for itself, but also then combining the evidence across the region. In my experience working in Israel, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, and elsewhere, is that each of these countries have a very siloed yet robust amount of information that is relevant to their neighbors. However, that information is not necessarily shared often. So I think that in replicating this work across the region, and in doing so, start to develop, whether it's an informal or formal working group in which information could start to be shared through interoperable channels, where best practices in terms of forensic exploitation can be shared. Things that, Bahrain, they developed a very robust forensic capacity out of necessity. This wasn't just some like distant war zone. They were dealing with this on their doorstep. So they had to develop these capacities, and they have developed some really interesting approaches that are not being applied in some of their neighboring states. And so I think that this could be a channel, not just in sharing information, but in sharing best practices and sharing different techniques. And then whether it could potentially serve as the kernel to evolve into a regional security body, maybe aligned with the OSCE, or there's something called CSEC in Eastern Europe, or REXA in Africa, that focuses specifically on arms control. and could be used potentially to do outreach in the broader region, where you now have, if you do replicate this and you quantify this regionally, not only you can identify opportunities for collective action to mitigate arms flows, but you could also then build up files of evidence of your grievances that you can then take to between the Gulf states and Iran, for example, to say, look, we have legitimate grievances here. You may as well. Let's talk about these things, hammer them out, and potentially could serve as a conduit to address broader security issues.
Thank you very much, Tim. Rasha, just taking a look at maybe two aspects. To begin with, where is Iran's, we'll say, supply of small arms to non-state actors having the biggest impact in the region, in your view, at the moment?
I think Yemen
Yes.
is having the most effect because the war is continuing because of the continuous arms smuggling. Yemen have the worst humanitarian crisis we saw in recent memory, and the Yemenis are suffering because of this arms smuggling and because of the political stalemate that Iran is keeping in Yemen.
That's great, thank you. And also, where in the Gulf do you think we would see an immediate lessening of the conflict and violence if we were able to implement an effective monitoring of small arms?
I think also in Yemen. Because mostly Yemen, the arms smuggling in Yemen, mostly it depends on the maritime routes. Therefore, close monitoring in this area in Bab el-Mandeb and in the Red Sea, I think it will be very effective in reducing the armed conflict. Of course, it will depend on how much they stack. How much weapon they stacked during these years, 5 years, 6 years of the conflict, but it most probably that when they see that the arms are not flowing like before, they will reconsider on negotiation, on stopping the certain fronts, for example, in Maghreb or other places, and they can sit on the table.
Great, thank you very much indeed. A number of interesting questions have come in, and I'm paraphrasing one from Ed in New Jersey, and I'll maybe give it to you, Richard. And this, as I said, is paraphrased. It's a longish question. With China's growing presence in the Gulf region, including the new partnership agreement with Iran, how will this influence efforts to bring more stability and security to the region?
Well, I mean, China is a major player and partner with everybody in the region. China is also verbally a big supporter of the Arms Trade Treaty. They've been very vocal about it. At the same time, they're less than transparent most of the time, in line with a lot of the global trends. I see it as a potential for positive development if it can be harnessed. So if China's talking to both sides at the same time, then perhaps China could be diplomatically recommended to start talking to both sides about the sort of confidence building measures that Tim was talking about. Let's at least get in the same room and talk to each other. Let's have our discussion as to what the grievances are. Saying that, I mean, it's a known fact, China is a large producer of small arms and light weapons. Potentially may see it as a marketplace, I'm not sure. But I think overall, in relation to Iran, if we get a number of actors taking a leading role, then these questions about security come out into a wider discussion, and we can see them in a wider framing, whereby China just working with Iran is not going to bring stability and security to Iran. It's a part of the wider issues. And so China also wants stability and security with the GCC states. So, yeah, I think, we should just start looking at China and say, okay, take a lead on this. Provide some of this global support that is talked about at the UN level.
Thanks very much, Richard. When you were speaking, Tim, you mentioned just in passing JCPOA. And a question, maybe two questions I'd like to ask you on JCPOA. There's a commonly held view, maybe, that perhaps we should focus more on the JCPOA and nuclear weapons as a priority, rather than putting more energy into addressing the small arms issue. Now, from your experience, I know you're not going to agree with this, but how do you react to that approach?
I mean, I think they are separate and they should be separate. You know, one shouldn't be held hostage to the other. You know, in coming back to the JCPOA would honestly be a bit easier than addressing the small arms issue, you know, because as Richard mentioned previously, it's like, it's something that most states do, right? And they want to reserve their right for it. And so therefore, it's like you could criticize people to an extent, right? But ultimately, it's just part and parcel of a state's repertoire and toolkit for when they perceive like a national security threat, right? You provide weapons or money. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. However, at the same time, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be focused on it, or there isn't a way to potentially do it in a more responsible manner, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, you're never going to be able to mitigate complete to get rid of diversion of all weapons, right? As soon as you send them in, you lose control over what happens to them. However, you know, there are programs and approaches that you can use to reduce diversion and to have some sort of oversight, whether it's a pre or post-transfer verification, even if it's just in the context of, you know, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to, you know, forces within Yemen, for example. There's actually, you could actually take internal learnings to address this as well. The King Salman Center for Humanitarian Relief, KS Relief, which is the main body in Saudi Arabia that directs humanitarian aid, before they send petroleum distillates, gasoline, to distributors in Iran, they will send out a team to verify that the distributor has the capacity to receive the amount of liters that they're going to be sending over. And you could apply the same thing to weapons, right? If there's a tribal sheikh, a warlord, whatever it may be, that is requesting 10,000 assault rifles, go do a verification of how many troops that person has under their command, and then do a follow-up verification. This can save you money. It could save human harm from the diversion of weapons, whether domestically or regionally. And it actually develop a better standard that is actually being applied in the US or elsewhere. So I think those could be win-win across the board there. But more directly to your original point is that while the JCPO is important, I think these other issues are equally as important on a regional scale, specifically around reducing conflict, raising barriers to groups to obtain this type of material. And really, as the region shifts to a more diplomatic, economic footing, focusing on cultural and other types of developments and away from security, this is ultimately just a distraction that I think we need to kind of move past, and because ultimately it is harming everyone and they're all interconnected in that space.
Great, thank you very much. Richard, just maybe a very specific, or maybe it's a general question. How is a state like Iran able to supply and support armed non-state actors almost as a foreign policy tool?
Yeah, I mean, as in the beginning, I mean, Iran has made it very clear from the outset in 1979, it wants to expand its revolution to other territories. Sure. And it's through the use of the small arms and light weapons that it's able to do this effectively.
Right.
Yemen is a classic example. Talking to analysts that were crossing into Yemen a few years ago, they would say, and they were being trafficked across the supply lines, they would say, they were always shown how the back of the pickup truck would have some Iranian weapons, and they were just shown that. Now, these weapons were small amounts. They're maybe even old. Who knows if they would even be useful? But word then got out that Iran was supplying the Houthis and others. That then puts the states around Yemen saying, wait a minute, we have a problem here. So Iran gets a lot of bang for its buck, very sort of poor use of words there, through the proliferation of small arms, because it helps to destabilize things generally, as Tim was talking about, and allows Iran to negotiate and navigate through these spaces and avoid particular issues. I mean, within my view on the JCPOA is that, yes, the small arms issue is something there should be a big focus on. But as we've already seen in the current negotiations, Iran says, no, we'll talk about that other stuff later. And they never will. Because for some reason, nuclear weapons are seen, they are a much larger global threat. But if we look at the countries around the world that either officially or unofficially acquire nuclear weapons, nobody's used them yet. Mm-hmm. So in terms of risk analysis, people using small arms is a day-to-day activity with large amounts of human destruction. Nuclear weapons less so, even though they still remain a global security threat, no question there. So perhaps instead of starting at the top down, greater sort of efforts can be made from starting from the bottom up by trying to get Iran into cooperation agreements that say, we're not going to do this and you're not going to do this either. And this does require some transparency and mutual agreement. But until those sort of political obstacles are overcome, Iran will continue to make use on a selective way with minimal sort of resource demands upon it to ensure that its foreign policy objectives of spreading the revolution continue to spread around the region.
Thank you very much indeed. Tim, I'll come back to you again. I mentioned that I may have two questions on JCPOA, but in fact, you handled the two in one, so it was great. But there's another one that I'd like to ask you. We're coming just to the end of the webinar, and we kind of end where we started with your report, as it were. You've given us in that report a range of recommendations and actions which should be implemented to limit illicit small arms transfers. In your view, what is the most important and urgent step that needs to be taken now in relation to controlling this issue?
Yeah, so I think some of the things I touched on previously is, really doing an assessment and understanding the issue, doing diagnostics first is really kind of the foundational starting point for this. You could try and encourage or insist that Iran kind of adhere to certain international arms control protocols. I think ICAO around with the International Civilian Aviation Organization, they have a requirement that for people who sign up to the treaty that they have to have a physical or chemical taggant within their C4 explosive manufacturer. Iran doesn't do this. I think that is a small win that could be potentially achieved in the near short term. Signing up for the ATT or adhering to its kind of protocols, I don't necessarily see that happening because a lot of states at this moment don't, and Iran kind of it's ceding and adhering to that. I don't see it necessarily happening. So really more on just the regional level and being able to quantify this stuff, document this stuff, and then presenting it in a non-politicized, evidence-forward manner that is open and transparent, I think is a very important first step around mitigating arms control throughout the region, or arms flows throughout the region.
Thank you very much, Tim. And again, thank you so much for your report, which makes excellent reading. And we're coming to the end because, as I said at the beginning, we start on time, we finish just on the hour. And I just want to try and wrap up by saying that on behalf of everybody at Bussola Institute and on my own behalf, we're enormously grateful to everybody involved in today's webinar. And of course, my very, very special thanks to Tim, to Rasha, and to Richard. I really am very grateful to each one of you for your invaluable contribution. And I think your views and your insightful analyses were really, really very worthwhile and worth listening to. And I really do appreciate the time that you invested in today's webinar. And I'm very grateful also to every one of our enormous number of guests for attending today's webinar. Indeed, I think, Tim, you must have brought an enormous number of people with you from the States and elsewhere through Atlantic Council. And I'm hugely grateful also to all of the people who have submitted questions. I tried to build bits of your questions into some of the ones I've asked. And as usual, we couldn't get round to all of them because, as is always the case with a webinar, time is against us, but thank you for submitting them. Our deepest gratitude also to the Atlantic Council, and especially to Catherine Wolfe, Associate Director for Middle East Security in the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. I know that she has worked very, very closely with Richard and the Bussola team in helping us to organize today's event. And of course, I also want to thank all of my own colleagues at Bussola for their ongoing commitment and support. We're having now at this stage webinars either every week or every couple of weeks, so they're under a lot of pressure, and thank you all for that. And to everybody again who participated, who was involved in any way today, we thank you very, very sincerely. And certainly, Tim, we will be delighted to join with you again in relation to any project that you are working on, and of course to work with the Atlantic Council. It has been a very good experience, and thank you all very much.